Welcome to another statistics seminar. Today we have a special seminar, it's our Blackwell Seminar, which happens once a year. It's established in 2020 in honor of David Blackwell. So today for the seminar, we have Cuellar from University of Pennsylvania talking about statistics and the law. And I just wanted to say that for the Blackwell Seminar, we try to highlight topics in statistics that are in the interface between statistics and ethics, other issues of equity such as racial disparities, and other, and Maria's work has stood out as a clear highlight in this area. And I also wanted to say that Maria was invited here based on various discussions we had as part of our DICE meetings, our DICE committee meetings. So how people get chosen to represent this Blackwell Seminar once a year is through our DICE committee. So if you would like to participate in those choices, please join the committee and vote in spring. This has mostly been voted on by students, so I just want to emphasize that. So, and welcome Maria once again. So hope you all enjoy the lecture. And if you have questions, please raise your hands. Maria will call on you if she is ready to take your question. All right, thank you, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, everyone, so much for inviting me to be here. It's a huge honor. And I wanted to thank Veronica for organizing my visit so seamlessly. It's such a very organized trip, and I'm very grateful for that. It's great to see some familiar faces and meet new people. You guys it's been a great visit so far. So I'm going to be telling you about statistics and the law, and this is covering a variety of topics: causal inference, forensic analysis, and systemic bias in the criminal justice system. I just wanted to say a few words about it being the Blackwell Seminar. So as a young woman of color, Professor Blackwell is an inspiration to me, and particularly for minorities, I think it's empowering to remember figures like Professor Blackwell, who paved the way for us to work in this field. And whether or not you consider yourself a minority, statisticians have the opportunity to use their expertise in the service of justice. And so I think what I want to show you in this talk is just opportunities for, how statisticians can become involved in this kind of research. Okay, so when Emma invited me, she mentioned this question of, we want to hear how should statistics be used in the law? And I wanted to introduce you to a few different topics from the law that are relevant for my research. The first one is that there is this fundamental tension between science and the law. So here's a quote from Keith Findley, an attorney, and he says, "The law generally demands certainty and finality, but science is always evolving, contingent, never final. This fundamental tension can lead to the misuse of scientific arguments and then to miscarriages of justice." So it can be that either erroneous arguments are introduced into legal cases, so they lead to errors in these decisions, or it could be that maybe there was a correct scientific argument, but the science became updated. And then, it became clear that there was an error in that case. Also in the law, arguments set a legal precedent, which means that when a case was decided with a certain argument, future cases rely on that past sentence to make new sentences. And so this kind of, I think of it as like the law and science are just kind of going in opposite directions in these ways, and this leads to errors. So what I will do today is I'm going to discuss some of these errors with examples from my research, and I will provide some improvements and suggest ways that the proposed solutions that are available today could be made more effective. Okay. So I'm going to start with first a case in civil law, then I'll introduce a case in criminal law, and then I'll have something that talks about the criminal justice system as a whole. Okay, so the first case is about attribution. And I'm going to start with the example of a man called Dwayne Johnson, who's shown here on the right. So Dwayne Johnson, who was born in 1972, worked as a school groundskeeper in California from 2012 to 2014. He developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is a form of cancer, in 2014. At this point, it was stage 4. And so he sued the company that produces Roundup, which is an herbicide. He sued Monsanto in 2018 for having caused his cancer. And he wanted to prove that his cancer was caused by his exposure to Roundup. So what kind of argument, what kind of statement should Dwayne's attorney make? I'm going to show you 3 different kinds of statements. Okay, so the first one is, given that a man is exposed to Roundup, it's likely that he'll develop cancer. Or given that a man developed cancer, it's likely that he was exposed to Roundup. And then finally, given that this man was exposed to Roundup and developed cancer, it's likely that it was the exposure to Roundup and not something else that caused the cancer. So these 3 different types of statements are called statements of forecasting, backcasting, and attribution. These terms were, I think, originally used by Phil David in some articles around 2010 or so. And so the way I think of the differences between these statements is statements of forecasting is what we're usually talking about in causal inference. When you think about a causal effect, it's usually the question of, does this exposure to Roundup cause cancer, right? And usually in average treatment effects, we might have like a randomized trial. Of course, here it wouldn't be ethical to do a randomized trial, but this is the kind of question that's answered with those trials. And notice that the uncertainty there is about the outcome. Will he develop cancer? Right. Backcasting statements are more about the uncertainty and the exposure, right? We're not really sure if this man is exposed to Roundup. In this specific example, there's evidence that he was exposed to Roundup, kind of large amounts of it. And then finally, attribution. It's an interesting kind of statement. It has no uncertainty in the exposure or in the outcome. And the uncertainty is actually about the attribution of, can you attribute the outcome to that specific exposure, or is it caused by something else? Right, so in the law, there are kind of 2 different questions. There's questions of what's called general causation, and that's usually dealing with questions probably 1 and 2, especially 1. That's what expert witnesses, who are usually epidemiologists, that's what they focus on. A lot of the arguments in court are about proving that Roundup is carcinogenic. But there's another legal requirement, which is specific causation, sometimes called but-for causation, which is statement number 3. And that's often not discussed by expert witnesses or studied in terms of empirical data. And so that's the question I'm going to focus on, is how do we answer questions of attribution? So to formalize questions of attribution, I introduce a causal parameter. So first, I'm just going to give you a little bit of notation. So Y is a binary outcome, which is, for instance, in this case, it's going to be 1 if the person has cancer, 0 if they don't. A is a binary exposure. 1 is if the person was exposed to Roundup, 0 if they were not. YA is a potential outcome if we had set the exposure to be little a, 0 or 1. And then X is some vector of covariates about the individual. Okay, so this is the causal parameter that I argue answers questions of attribution. How do we think of this? Okay, so it's the probability of causation, it's a function of X. And the way I think of it is as follows. We condition on the stuff that we know happened in this case. So we know that the person had cancer, we know the person was exposed, and we know some covariates about them. That's all stuff that happened that we observe. And the uncertainty, the question is, what would have happened, right? What's the probability that had the person not been exposed, oh, you don't see my mouth. Had the person not been exposed, they wouldn't have had cancer. There's a clicker. Anyway, I can just point out. All right, so it's conditioning on all this stuff we know. What's the probability that if the person hadn't been exposed, they wouldn't have had cancer? Notice this is a little different than a usual causal effect, if you're used to seeing those, because not only are we conditioning on the fact that you're exposed or treated, we're also conditioning on the fact that you have the outcome. And that's very strange. It's unusual. Okay, but I argue that this is really what we care about. If this is closer to 0, it means that we can't really attribute the cancer to the Roundup, because maybe something else is what caused the cancer. And if it's closer to 1, then we really think like this is the thing that caused the cancer. Okay, so that's cool. I think it's really nice that we can formalize this kind of statement as as an equation. But there's obviously the question of how do we estimate this? It's dealing with counterfactuals, right? The fact that like Dwayne Johnson already has cancer and already was exposed, we can't really turn back time, but we can imagine what would have happened had he not been exposed. So that it doesn't exist in the real world. We have to make some assumptions to get some estimation, right? And so that's what we do. So here I'm showing you just like a sequence of steps that are the traditional ways of estimating parameters in causal inference. We start out with defining a causal parameter, step 1. We make some identification assumptions, and we get to some observable quantity that could be calculated from real-world data. And then we're able to estimate that quantity. That's where we run into statistics, right? I feel like the first step, like 1 to 2, is more just causal inference. And then 2 and on, I think of as like statistics. And at that point, you can make some estimation assumptions and use data to get an estimate and a measure of uncertainty. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some identification assumptions you can make to arrive at an observable quantity. So I've already made one, which is the fact that there's a binary outcome in treatment. I also assume consistency, and this allows me to go from potential outcomes to actual outcomes. I assume no unobserved confounders. This one, of course, it's the kind of assumption that's satisfied in like a randomized experiment. It won't hold in the case of Dwayne Johnson, right? So we have to think about what we would do in that specific application. And then monotonicity, this one, I think, is a not too strong of an assumption to make when you have a harmful exposure, because we usually think that outcomes will be worse when you're exposed to the chemical than if you're not. Yes.
There's one question on Zoom. So Dan, you have your hand raised. Do you want to speak up?
Yes, thanks. I just wanted to ask a clarifying question on your definition. So in contrast to some of like the causal inference work I've seen where you think of the outcomes as fixed but just unobserved, you're thinking here in the definition about like a population of potential people with the same covariates as this particular person. And if you sampled from them uniformly, given that they were exposed, what's the probability of them developing cancer? I'm just trying to understand like what the sampling frame is for the probabilistic statement.
No, I think that the probabilistic statement just says there's nothing about sampling even in there. It's just saying for people like him, I mean, it depends on what we can observe, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think of this as just like it's the probability of causation for all the people with the same covariates as the person that we're talking about. So it's really just like a small group of people.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, so it's not sampling at this point.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so if we make these assumptions, then the probability of causation, which I showed you earlier, that has this counterfactual and cannot be estimated directly with data, now becomes a really simple expression, which is just 1 minus the risk ratio, where the risk ratio is defined like this. And sometimes people define it as the reciprocal of this. But it's a function of the risk ratio, and we deal with the risk ratio all the time. So this is great. Right, now we just have to estimate it. And then we can get some estimates and confidence intervals if we like. The one thing that I was concerned about is that because the probability of causation is like one number between 0 and 1, if we were to make parametric assumptions and we were wrong about, misspecifying the model, if we were wrong about what parametric model we're using, then we could have misspecification and some bias, and then it could be that our estimate is off, and we really can't afford to be very far off because we just have one number. There's a lot relying on this. And so I worked on a paper with Edward Kennedy where we derived an estimator that's an influence function based estimator to do this in a non-parametric way. And so we have a non-parametric estimator of that identified observable quantity of the 1 minus the risk ratio. The way that we do this is we follow a sequence of steps shown here. We actually project the data onto a parametric function, sort of unintuitively. Then we have we derive an influence function for this projection parameter. And then we derive from that an influence function based estimator. And the really nice thing about this is that it gives us non-parametric estimation with valid confidence intervals. And so, it's non-parametric. It allows for the derivation of valid confidence intervals under weak structural assumptions. And so this is a project we worked on some years ago. And it's really cool because now we've gone from having the right causal parameter that we should be using to talk about attribution. And now we have a way of estimating it and getting something from data. The next step I'm going to show you is using data and using this parameter to show you how it works. I don't have data about the Dwayne Johnson case. That's not been made public. And just to tell you a little bit more about that, the case was closed. He won. And then it was later appealed. So he got some settlement, and then the settlement was made smaller by the company Monsanto. But the argument in his case was all about forecasting. So it was all about, is this chemical carcinogenic, and did Monsanto know about it? And they didn't give enough warning on the labeling of the bottle. So that was like how that case was settled. But I will show you how one could use data to estimate the probability of causation. Okay, so I have some data from JPAL, which is the Poverty Action Lab out of MIT and Harvard. I used to actually work there before going to graduate school. It's a really cool organization that runs randomized trials all over the world to learn about poverty, very broadly defined. And on their website, they have tons of data of RCTs that's like very nicely labeled. And so I encourage you, if you ever need a really nice data set, to go there. They ran a randomized control trial in Western Kenya to study a question about water and disease. So what happens is that in these villages, people drink water from these natural springs that are shown here on the left. They'll go up to the spring and fill up their jug with some water. But there are a lot of people walking in the spring, there are animals nearby, and so this water is contaminated. And it often leads to childhood diarrhea, which in this area can be a deadly disease. So what they were doing in this randomized trial is they said, okay, what if we encase the spring with this cement structure that's very affordable and lasts a long time? If we encase it and then make it so that the water comes out of a tube, maybe it'll make it so that the water's cleaner and it'll improve the outcome of childhood diarrhea. And indeed, that's what happened. They ran the RCT and they found that the water coming out of the spring is much cleaner in terms of E. coli bacteria, and that the childhood diarrhea cases go way down. So I took this data set and I asked the question of attribution. I said, okay, let's imagine like thinking about it as like the Dwayne Johnson case, like for a minute. Imagine if you're thinking of it as like, okay, for the children who were exposed to this dirty water and got the disease, can we attribute the disease to that exposure? Or did they get it in another way? Was there another cause for it? And so, so that was the question about attribution. And using both parametric and non-parametric estimation, I find that, this is making the parametric assumptions and this is not. With the parametric assumptions, you get that it's almost 70% probability of causation. So you really can attribute their disease to the spring water. And we have a valid confidence interval. Well, I don't know about that one being valid because I don't know if the assumptions are really correct. But the non-parametric inference function-based estimator says the probability of causation is much lower, around 12%, with a confidence interval that is valid. And so this really shows you like misspecification could be a big deal. And so, I conclude that we really cannot attribute the average child's disease to the spring water. So this is kind of like reconceiving the RCT as like a legal trial to estimate this attribution question. So that's what I worked on in a previous paper. What I'm working on now is thinking of using the probability of causation in randomized control trial data to kind of use it as a diagnostic test after the RCT has been run, looking at the cases where people were exposed and did get the outcome, and trying to see if we can really attribute their outcome to the exposure. Because with randomized trials, you can say, okay, like we're going to compare average treatment effects, like the treatment group with the control group. So it's like an average effect. And even if you do look at heterogeneous treatment effects, you're still looking at these big groups and you're not looking at attribution, right? So what I think this contributes is looking at cases where many other causes could have been leading to that final outcome that we saw. And perhaps if for some subgroups, the probability of causation is very low, maybe there's a lot of other stuff going on that's causing that outcome. And for future treatments, we could look for those specific cases and think like maybe for them, it won't be very effective if we give them this treatment because there's just a lot of other stuff going on. And maybe it's interesting to study like what other stuff is going on, right? What are other possible causes that are leading to this outcome? And so that's what I'm working on now. Okay. So that is the story of attribution and in the civil case that I wanted to show you. So last thing I'll say about it is I think it's interesting, that the proper way of answering these questions leads to a new statistical methodology that we hadn't really encountered much before. Okay. So now, oh, yes, questions.
A little bit of intuition for the probability of causation, like what would be a value that you think would be compelling in like a legal setting?
Great question. So thinking about the civil cases, so in civil law, there's a burden of proof so that like one side will win if they've shown that it's more likely than not that something is the case. And so there, the boundary is 50%. And so basically, if you've shown the probability of causation is higher than 50%, and the confidence interval hopefully is like above that as well, then it's more likely than not that the thing really was caused by that exposure. And if it's lower, then it's probably caused by something else.
And I'm curious, the burden of proof is 50%. In the randomized clinical trial example that you just showed, where the evidence forecasting approach is that the intervention worked, and then using the attribution approach, we use the non-parametric way, that it probably didn't work below that 50% burden. So is that the kind of attribution that sort of help? Attribution means word power, you have like less evidence to conclude that.
Well, here's the interesting thing is I think that it does work. But I think what the probability of causation shows is that it's less effective in some groups because there are other causes that are kind of messing that up and leading to that outcome. And so I think they're just getting at different questions. Like you can have places where the average treatment effect is high and then the probability of causation is low. I think those are interesting, but also they could both be high, both be low.
Okay. Not that one is going to lead to like different set of people findings on average than the other. Kind of like,
I think they're different questions. Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's the kind of thing where you have to kind of think about it for a minute, and I've been thinking about it for a while, so it makes sense to me now. But it's, yeah, I think of it as more of like the probability of causation is just looking at like which of these many causes could have led to this outcome. Okay, any other questions about attribution? Because I'm going to switch gears to something else. Okay. Oh, yes.
Say it's like 49%, and then like people were exposed to some drug, and then the outcome was that they like crashed their car. I don't know if this would be a citizen, but as long as I make up to 49% of those accidents, I can get off that free basically.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's up for interpretation, like what it means in each case, because I think that hasn't been settled. But there is some really interesting writing about, there's very little writing about the probability of causation that I know of. Also, Udapro calls it the probability of necessity. I should have mentioned that earlier. But some writing that I love is from Fred Mosteller in like 1986. He's looking at cases of soldiers who were exposed to radiation and then developed cancer, and they're suing the government, trying to get settlements. And so what Mosteller argues is that if the probability of causation is like 70%, and the soldiers have requested, $100, that they should receive $70 as their settlement. That the probability of causation should be the percentage of the settlement that they requested. So that's how that should be interpreted. Yeah, question.
There was a note on Zoom, if you could just repeat the question.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, this question's about the width of the confidence interval. I don't have a great answer for you there. I'm testing right now how the width of the confidence interval changes, and depending on sample size, and how it compares to the parametric method. I've been mostly focusing on the non-parametric method now, and so I don't have a lot of comparisons to the parametric method. So I don't know what to say about it. All I know is like mathematically it's correct, and so I think that's the one we should be trusting. So okay, totally switching gears. Think of, if you have any more questions about the topic, save them to the end. I'll have more time hopefully then. Okay, forensic science, totally different case. This is in criminal law, different side of my research, and this is a case I'm going to tell you about. The case of Jimmy Genrich. So in 1991, oh, we have some things about here. Tiny, you can't see it. I'll just tell you what it is. There were 4 pipe bombs. There are these bombs that are made out of pipes, kind of at home, and they exploded in this town in Colorado called Grand Junction. It's a small town, usually very peaceful, not a lot of crime. But 4 pipe bombs exploded. There were 2 casualties, and they didn't have any suspects until Genrich went to the bookstore and he requested the Anarchist Cookbook. This is a book that is sort of semi-famous, and it has, I have a copy of it. It has like instructions for how, well, I looked it up after this. Instructions for how to like make pipe bombs and like break into locks and like be an anarchist. Right. And so he like asked about this. And the bookstore owner thought this guy's a little strange. He asked for this weird book that helps you make bombs. So I'm going to call the police. And so the police, really with the help of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, the federal group, they came and searched his home, and they found that he had some handheld tools like wire cutters and wire strippers. Then there was a forensic comparison. So the wire from one of the bombs that was found in the debris of the crime scene was compared to new cuts that were made with Genrich's tools. So you can see here, this is kind of what the tool mark comparison would have looked like. This is the crime scene mark, and this is a test mark that's made with the suspect's tool. The test mark is usually made in a longer piece of metal, so you can have like more information about the entire tool's details. And so this was really the only evidence against Genrich. An examiner called John O'Neill gave his testimony, and he said that he had matched Genrich's tools to the 4 bombs, quote, to the exclusion of any other tool in the world. And the way that this is done is that examiners use a light microscope, a comparison microscope, and like you see on TV, and the marks are sort of aligned until they're close enough. And the examiner has to subjectively decide whether the marks are similar enough to be considered from the same source and not different enough that they could not be from the same source. And once they've decided that, they concluded to match. So this man testified, and then Genrich was given a life prison sentence. And throughout this, he maintained he was innocent. Last thing I'll say about it is that the wire was 1 millimeter in diameter, and the mark that was matched was less than 0.25 millimeters. And so, yeah, Jim Genrich is in prison. The Innocence Project is a group of attorneys who works pro bono, well, not for profit, to exonerate individuals who they think are innocent. And they're defending James Genrich to get him out of prison. They don't think he committed this crime, and I've been an advisor on this case with them. Okay, so how does forensic toolmark comparison work? This is, some example from the atlas, the color atlas of forensic toolmark identification. Some examples of like when a lock is picked at a crime scene. So what examiners do is that they will have marks from a crime scene and then a suspect or candidate tool, and they'll take the tool to the lab and make test marks with the tool on a softish material. They have like plasticine or lead is usually used. And they'll try making marks at different angles and directions to get a sense for like how the tool generally makes marks, because it can vary with the different directions. And then they select the best mark out of these test marks to make the comparison. This is all subjectively decided by the human. And anyway, yeah, they make the comparison with a light microscope, and then they decide whether it's considered an identification. So this is how it's done even today. But over the last couple of decades, there have been some government reviews of these forensic science methods. The most influential ones was one from 2009, National Academies of Science, one from 2016, the President's Council for Science and Technology. Scientists who were not forensic scientists reviewed like what is going on in forensic labs and how are forensic scientists making decisions. And they found a ton of problems. And I won't get into those, but I'm happy to talk about those. I teach a whole class about this. It's called about forensic analysis at Penn. But one of the things they did is they said that there's a call for the development of objective methods to make scientific investigations as objective as possible, so the results don't depend on the investigator. They said that we need comparisons to be more accurate, to be repeatable. There's been some research showing that when examiners make the same comparison with the same evidence over time, they change their mind. And hoping to avoid bias. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that at the end. Anyway, so I'm responding to this call for objective methods, and I decided we need to make an algorithm to make these comparisons objective. But there's not very good data available. So with the help of pretty wonderful undergraduate students at Penn, I generated some of whom are here, generated some original data. So what I did is I collected kind of the simplest, most generic tool, which is a flathead screwdriver, and made marks on lead, shown here on the left. I made these marks. So the screwdrivers are consecutively manufactured screwdrivers. That's kind of seen in the forensic literature as like the hardest case, because if there's anything in the manufacturing process that makes tools look really similar to each other, I mean, that would be the hardest case. So anyway, I got Klein Tools to mail me sequentially manufactured screwdrivers. They sent me videos to prove that they were in fact sequentially manufactured. These are made in the US. I was going to go to the factory, but it was the pandemic and they wouldn't let me go. Anyway, they just mailed them to me. I also got this mechanical rig shown there, which is basically a machine that makes tool marks in a totally replicable way. So it's kind of the same force, same direction, same speed, everything, every time with a motor. And then I also found a 3D handheld scanner. So there are these microscopes that will scan objects in 3D, but it takes about a minute to scan each mark. But I found this really cool handheld tool that was recently developed at, I think it was out of MIT for aerospace engineering, where like they're looking at looking for cracks on like rocket ships, I think. And so they like press this handheld microscope has like a gel disc at the bottom. And so you press this disc onto the surface and it has really high resolution down to a micrometer. And you can see the cracks in whatever surface. And so I use this handheld scanner to scan these marks in 3D. And this is what they look like. So this is a mark from one screwdriver. The screwdriver was kind of like, you know, the mark was made like this in this case, right? So this is the striation marks that screwdriver left. And I have a package that was developed by my co-author in R. So you can do this all in R. It takes the 3D mark and then you can pick a cross section and then just cut it and then get the signal of all the different depth, like all the different striation marks. And then from there, you can cut off the edges and like fit a smooth version of the signal to remove any of the macro weird diagonal structure. Anyway, you get a signal. So for each tool mark, you get a nice signal that has super high resolution in micrometers. Let's see how many micrometers. It's like about, I think it's like 2 millimeters wide and like 5 micrometers tall. And so there's like some data pre-read, but that's what the data looks like. And I made a bunch of replicates per each tool and side. And so, and we had these 20 tools. I also made replicates at different angles and directions to see how that would alter the way the marks look. But the whole point was figuring out whether the marks made by one tool, so the marks within tool, are different than the marks made between tools, right? Like comparing those variabilities. These are some examples of some tool mark signals. So this is from tool 1, side A, 8 replicates. So these are all just 8 marks that are kind of overlaid on top of each other. And you can see they're really similar to each other. On the right-hand side is once they've been aligned, if you just calculate the correlation of each mark with mark 1, like all these pairwise correlations, they're all very high, meaning they're all very similar to each other. This is the marks made by a second tool. So you can see like they're really similar within tool and different between tools. And so the way that we thought to analyze this is by using a score-based likelihood ratio approach. What is this? So basically in forensic statistics, ever since like 1977, Dennis Lindley proposed that instead of just looking at these categorical responses of it's a match or not a match, that we should instead report a likelihood ratio that compares the two probabilities. So really what it is if you have the ratio form of Bayes' rule and you write it like this, can I zoom? Well, you don't need to zoom in too much. I think you can see it. If we have E is the evidence, HP is the prosecution hypothesis. So usually this would be that the marks match, and HG is the defense hypothesis. Usually it's that they don't match. Then we can write the posterior odds as the probability that the prosecution hypothesis is right, given the evidence, over the probability that the defense hypothesis is right, given the evidence. And this is equal to the likelihood ratio times the prior odds. The kind of consensus nowadays and the recommendation from agencies, both in the US and in Europe, is that the forensic examiner should only report the likelihood ratio and should not give any opinion about the prior odds or the posterior odds, because that should be left to the judge or jury, the trier of fact. It's another way of saying that deciding whether the person's guilty or not guilty, like, shouldn't be up to the toolmark examiner. that they should really just be given an opinion about the tools and the tool marks, not about the guilt, really. And so this is like the thing that we're interested in reporting is the likelihood ratio. And one way to get that is we fit these two densities. The green one is the density of, so for each pair that we know is not a match because we generated the data, right? Two marks made by different tools. What's their similarity between the two of them? And that's really just a correlation in this case. In other types of data, they've used very complicated scores, like they combine correlations with number of peaks and valleys, and like they combine it all with a random forest, and it's anyway, scores can get complicated, but this one's just a correlation. These are all the similarities of all the pairs of non-matches, the green one. And then the pink one or red one is the similarities of all the pairs of known matches. And what's really nice, oh, and we fit some, so here the densities are with the thin lines, and then the thick lines are these beta distributions that we fit on top of them. So what's really nice is that there's not much overlap between the two. This is showing that the distribution of known matches just tends to be like they're just more similar to each other, and the known non-matches are like less similar to each other. And this is like great because then we can use this to classify new pairs of tools. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a question about the digression you had about the not using the
Mm. Yeah.
So, I understand why you well, in an adversarial legal system, the home in the U.S., neither is an advocate for the truth. They are both sides are advocates for the clients, and they'll give posterior of zero, or I'm sorry, prior of zero, or it would choose a prior that would work the best for the clients. Not necessarily.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So if like the defense attorney were to pick these values, they'd be like, oh, I know what that is.
Yeah.
It's I win.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah.
But because of that, we can't let that sort of prosecution treat the priors. Would you say then, and because of that, you don't like
Right. The question. Sorry, I'm supposed to repeat the questions. The question is about the prior odds and like why we shouldn't be, it makes sense that we shouldn't let just the defense attorney or the prosecuting attorney determine the prior odds because they would just pick an obvious answer for like whatever helps them win. Yeah.
Right. Would you say that a Bayesian approach is not, I don't know, might be too strong, but it might not be the best option for an adversarial legal system, like but it may make more sense in an inclusive, even with a coordinate system like Europe.
Yeah, no, that's yeah, is the Bayesian approach the proper way to express how this works in the adversarial system, and does it work better in an inquisitorial system? I think that I think it does make a lot of sense to use this in an adversarial system because of what you were saying. Like we're comparing the numerator with the denominator. Like we're always, it's kind of like the balance, right? It's like which side wins, the prosecution or the defense, and it's always like these two adversaries competing. So I think it is the right way to do it. What I don't know is whether people actually reason in this way, right? That's the part that, and I think there's some research showing they don't do it perfectly. So I don't know, even if you give the jury or judge a perfect likelihood ratio, and even if they have like a perfect prior odds, they might not like multiply them together to get a posterior odds, right? Like they might be doing something different with their incorporation of that evidence from the examiner. So that's what I don't know. I don't know. I feel like this is like how it should work in some ideal situation, and it helps us, having it formalized this way helps us have a way of like saying this is what should be expressed. But I don't know if in reality then it all flows perfectly the way that it should in Bayes' rule. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is a very nice result, and it's, I thought, kind of surprising, right? It really shows that tool marks made by the same tool are more similar to each other than tool marks made by different tools. And this actually holds even when you have marks made at different angles and directions. And because that's a big concern is like, what if the mark is made in a totally crazy way? Well, in our data, it showed that, they really do separate very well. Have some measures of sensitivity specificity. They like, if you use this threshold where the two distributions intersect, then that's like, if that threshold in the term of the similarity score axis, like use it as a threshold to classify, it works incredibly well. And anyway, so that's nice. We can classify when a pair of marks is made by the same source or not. And we can get this measure of uncertainty by using the likelihood ratio. So if you have a new pair of marks and you calculate their correlation after alignment is 0.75, say, the likelihood ratio at that point is going to be the height of the red curve over the height of the green curve. And that's how you would use this, right? So this is just a nice tool, and I think it can be used in labs to make comparisons in an objective way. Yeah, question. This includes both. So the question was about the angles and directions and the different, what they're called degrees of freedom. These actually include the marks made at all the different angles and directions, but we considered them same source if they were made by the same tool, even at different angles. And it still separates nicely. One last thing I'll say about this is that, that sensitivity and specificity holds when we have like a large enough tool mark, but as the mark gets smaller and smaller, this might not be as nice. So here there are two plots, one of sensitivity and one of specificity, and I wrote down what each one of those is in case anyone ever forgets, because I feel like I always have to look it up. Sensitivity seems like it doesn't really change with signal length. But for specificity, as we're going down in millimeters from 2 millimeters down to 0, the specificity goes down very dramatically. And this makes sense if you think about it. The mark gets tinier and tinier. You just have a few peaks. And those two tiny peaks are going to start matching kind of like every tool mark. You're going to have a lot more false positives. And that's going to make the specificity go down. And so as that's going down, you see, the performance of the method is just much worse. And if we get to the point where, the size of the mark, like the one in Jimmy Genrich's case, this method does not work well at all. That would be around here, I think. It's pretty bad. And so that's, some interesting evidence for the fact that like even in this really nice case scenario where you have like the cleanest marks with the nicest tools and different angles and directions, like we really can't make that comparison very well. I don't think that the human approach, which has generally been shown to be worse than the algorithms, we can really trust it. Okay, any last questions about this forensic stuff? Yeah.
And so you said this could be used in the lab, but is the idea that like if a tool comes in, like what is the bench the tool used, then they will go and get a whole bunch of other inches and then do the experiment?
No, that's a good question. So the forensic comparison is really like when you have a candidate tool matching it to a crime scene mark. You could do that with different tools.
So what I mean is if they have a candidate, would they go out and buy different wrenches and repeat the experiment to collect new data to figure out the?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So your question's about, I did this with screwdrivers. What if the tool was a wrench?
Right, exactly.
And would this still hold? Yeah, great question.
That's why, but I think even more than that, I might be missing the point, but it seems like you need to. Well, I guess what would it look like? Even if it's another screwdriver. Like,
right. So that.
Screwdriver versus wrench, it's more like how would you?
Yeah. So we tried it out with screwdrivers from a different experiment that someone else did, and it worked equally well. But that's not in this paper. We're still working on that. The question is more about like, what about a different kind of tool? I think with a wrench, it would be similar because it's a similar kind of mark. something like wire cutters, where you have multiple surfaces that cut a wire and interact with each other, that could lead to just different kinds of marks.
But is the idea, so if we have another screwdriver from another, case,
Source, yeah.
and do you, I'm somehow like very confused about what you actually do. Do you make marks with that?
Oh yeah,
screwdriver?
when you have a new crime scene mark and a new candidate tool from a suspect, the idea is the procedure would be make candidate marks with the candidate tool, right? Make test marks, and then get the 3D scans of both the crime scene mark and the test mark and compare them in terms of their similarity.
Okay.
Measure the similarity and see where it falls. If it's more to this side, then we think it's going to be a match. I thought you were, no, I think that it's not very clear. And I think you're right. The question of like, how much does this generalize to other kinds of tools is the next question. It's like, yeah. And so we're working now on wire cutters. That's the next step, because it gets more complicated from here. This is kind of the simplest case that we can start with. Let me just finish the thing and then we'll do a couple of questions. So I'll just have a last couple of slides about a last topic, which is about errors spreading in the criminal justice system, about contextual bias. In forensic science, there's something called contextual bias. This was defined by psychologists doing psychology experiments. And it's defined as the errors that occur when well-intentioned experts are vulnerable to making erroneous decisions by extraneous influences, what are called task-irrelevant information. So this is like when the toolmark examiner is comparing the two toolmarks, and then like the detective comes and says, you know, man, I think this guy really did it, and this is what the horrible crime scene looked like, and they have a criminal background, et cetera, et cetera. The toolmark examiner, that from psychology experiments, we know they change their mind with this extraneous information, and they might decide, they go from match to a non-match. And this has been shown in a ton of different disciplines, including DNA, like fingerprints, blood spatter analysis, tool marks, DNA. Okay, so there are kind of two different kinds of ways that this bias spreads. So that I told you about, like the first kind, it's just like one examiner hearing all this contextual information gets bias. There's something called bias cascade, defined by psychologists, where all it is that there's task irrelevant information given to the examiners, to the crime scene investigators. They communicated to the laboratory personnel, who communicated to the analysts. So there's all this information getting, biasing the analysts in this kind of cascade way. And then there's also bias snowball, where analysts communicate with each other. Maybe the fingerprint analyst tells the toolmark analyst what they think is the answer, and so on. And so they bias each other. So in a paper with Amanda Luby and Jackie Mauro, what we worked on was trying to formalize this using Bayes' rule, the likelihood ratio approach I was showing you earlier, and just seeing where the bias comes and like how it gets compounded when people communicate with each other and when they get extraneous information. So I'll just show you a picture, which is we have bias cascade on the left-hand side, bias snowball on the right-hand side of the top row. These are the examiners, the analysts, and they're talking to the trier of fact. And so the conclusion that we get to after this formalization is that when you have biasing information from different directions, it gets compounded. And so, if the judge or jury hears, oh, the fingerprints match, that's not just the fingerprints match, right? That's also hearing all this information that they were getting. Maybe they communicated with the DNA person, et cetera. So the bias gets compounded for the final determination of guilt. And so in this paper, we show that there is contextual bias from all the different stages in the forensic analysis, and it biases the trier of fact's decision pretty dramatically. So that's just showing like errors kind of in the system as a whole. Okay. So let me just conclude. So I wanted to talk to you guys about different examples of how to use statistics in the law. And I showed you some current arguments, and I suggested improvements by formalizing arguments. So the first question was about I mentioned there might be errors that kind of come into the case the first time, like when a case is decided, maybe some incorrect scientific statement is made, and that is what the case is based on. So that was an error made in the first stage. There are some what are called admissibility standards. They're different by state, and there's a federal standard that's different as well. And these are supposed to be like guardrails, like they're supposed to prevent like bad science, or junk science is what they love to call it, from getting into the court in the first place. These are pretty vague, and I think they don't go far enough. There's some work being done now by statisticians to kind of formalize these admissibility standards from the law, kind of like what I've been doing, telling you guys, like, this is how we formalize things, this is how we express it in math. Doing that with the requirements and like saying what would be the proper way to, for example, talk about error rates in a forensic comparison. How do we estimate them? Like also like the way that it's being done today, like how do we measure error rates? The way that it should be done in the future, how should we do it? And then when there's a case in which like new evidence shows that the original arguments were incorrect, they're what are called changed science statutes. This is a very new thing that has been changing so far in only 7 states. There are recourses for people who have been convicted to say, hey, I want my case reopened because I think that there was something wrong with the science, and like this has been updated. So only in 7 states can you do this, and everywhere else there's like finality. Like after you've exhausted your appeals, like you can't really reopen the case. Oh, I had them in my notes and I don't have them with me right now, but I'll pull them up in a minute. So this is cool, but like, you know, we just have started those changes, and I think that there need to be more options, right? I think it needs to be clearer what kinds of things shouldn't be allowed in court in the first place. And then also, you know, make it available for people to reopen their cases if there's some clear error. Okay, thank you. That was it.
So thank you all. Yeah, we'll take some questions. I just want to say the theater will get to about 20 minutes, so if you want to get something, please do. But yes, I think we'll have to do that.
So, has anyone tried to do this assessment you did with the tools and the actual experts? That their sensitivity, specificity?
Oh, okay. Yeah, so the question is about like, I evaluated my objective method in terms of its accuracy, but have people tried to do this with the current practice of what people are doing in today, with human comparison? Not with handheld tools, but it's starting to happen. That's been a lot of the work that has been coming out of those government reviews has been to measure the accuracy of current practice, which is a lot of it is subjective. Fingerprints, firearms, a ton of different disciplines. There are just very few of these so far, and there's a lot of disagreement about whether they were done properly. The main, I think, most interesting discussion about them right now is they're called black box studies. And so they test examiners, they give them like, say you're an examiner, I'll give you like 100 pairs of fingerprints, and I'll test you and I know the right answer, and I test you to see how well you do. And I do it for like 100 examiners, get an average rate to see like what's the false positive, false negative rate, true positive, true negative rate. But it turns out with fingerprints and with firearms and tool marks, the conclusions that the examiners give are identification, that's like a match, exclusion, it's like a non-match, and inconclusive. And there are a bunch of inconclusives. And there's a huge disagreement about like, is that a correct answer? Is that an incorrect answer? How do we put those into the calculations of sensitivity and specificity? And there's huge disagreement about it. Some examiners delete them from the denominator. They're like, oh, these we just don't count. And so like, imagine they don't matter. And so you have like, you know, false positive rate of 0%. And so it's starting to happen, very slow, very expensive, a lot of resistance to doing that. And some people, last thing I'll say, I've been thinking about this too much because people think that it's irrelevant because that's not the error rate for this comparison. They say for a case, you're going to have a guy testifying about the fingerprints. In this case, you give me an error rate from a black box study, that's not the same as this. So why do you have the black box study error rate? I don't care about that. So there's fighting about that. There's a lot of fighting. So anyway, good question. Thank you. Yeah.
Are you familiar with Michael Townsend?
No, I'm not familiar with Michael Townsend.
Well, he has a PhD in logic, in grad school, and, he also has a JD, and he's a professor of law here.
Okay, I'll look him up, Michael
And,
Townsend.
he's interested in
Okay,
data.
I'll look him up. Yeah, I do know her. Yeah.
That's a great book she wrote, isn't it? It's horrifying.
Yeah. France, right? Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yeah. Okay, the states that have the change science statutes are California, Connecticut, Michigan, Nevada, Texas, West Virginia, and Wyoming. They're kind of like not expected.
Yeah, but not how to divide.
Like Texas has some of the best standards in this case because, and there's some of the best forensic laboratories because they went so low. Like they gave, capital punishment to some people and then realized that it was incorrect. Like the science that was being used to convict them initially was incorrect, so they couldn't repair those mistakes. People were executed. And so Texas has been doing a lot of this work, and it's great. I mean, they have really good standards nowadays.
All right, let's wrap up the
Thank you.
official portion. Please feel free to stay in touch.
Thank you.